In previous videos, we have repeatedly emphasized that the era of tanks is fading and drones are hot on its heels. But when you're at war with an enemy whose technical equipment is dozens of years behind the West, the time still comes when you have to dust off these monsters and get going. Let's take a look at what kinds of tanks Western allies have in store to help Ukraine in its battle against the Russian invaders, and what advantage they'll give the Ukrainian Armed Forces on the battlefield. Why don't we start with the European country that has provided key support to Ukraine from literally the very first day of the Russians' insidious invasion. We're speaking, of course, about the colossal assistance that has come from Poland. By April 2022, the country has already received more than 2.5 million Ukrainian citizens seeking a safe place in these dark times, transferred almost the entire reserve of spare parts and weapons for the MiG-29 fighters, signed the largest contract for the sale of 60 KRAB self-propelled guns, and sent the country 100 armored personnel carriers and other weapons worth over $2 billion. Additionally, let's not forget about the agreement between Poland and Ukraine on a joint venture for the manufacture of military equipment, as well as 240 T-72M1 and T-72M1R tanks transferred from previous service. Although the USSR began producing these giants back in 1969, Poland and Czechoslovakia were still able to produce the T-72 at home thanks to a license granted to the Warsaw Pact countries, among which the T-72 was the most common combat vehicle up until the collapse of the USSR in 1991. The tanks that rolled off the assembly line in Poland and Czechoslovakia were of better and more consistent workmanship than the original. However, in return, they were left without composite armor, which greatly affected the weight of the already not-so-weighty vehicle, decreasing it from 41.5 tons to 37 tons. Various T-72 modifications have been produced for decades, during which the characteristics of its armor have changed a lot. The original tanks had uniformly cast steel armor using shielded armor technology and were relatively well protected by the early 1970s standards. By 1979, the USSR began building a T-72 modification with composite armor, similar to that of the T-64 in the front of the turret and hull, and by late 1980s, the T-72s, which were in service not only with the USSR but also with other world countries, were equipped with elements of reactive armor. The TPD-K1 laser rangefinder complex appeared in the T-72 starting in 1974. Earlier models were equipped with an optical parallax rangefinder which was impossible to use at a distance of less than 1,100 yards, and even despite the innovation available, in some export versions, a laser rangefinder was not installed until 1985. In some cases, only the tanks of platoon commanders received them. After 1985, all standard-built T-72s came with reactive armor, a more powerful B-84 engine with 840 horsepower on board, and the main gun with a modernized design, capable of firing guided anti-tank missiles from the barrel. These upgrades were able to put the T-72 on par with the newer T-80, but only a small number of these later versions made it to the economically disadvantaged Warsaw Pact allies and foreign customers prior to the collapse of the Soviet bloc. The T-72M and T-72M1 are Polish-made models, created under license by Bumar Labidi in Gliwice since 1982. Like earlier T-72s, the T-72M did not have side skirts. Instead, the model had gill-type armor panels on either side of the front of the hull. The T-72A was the first modification whose plastic side skirts covered the upper part of the suspension, and separate panels protected the sides of the fuel and glove boxes. After some time, the Polish T-72s also received 902W TUCHA smoke grenade launchers at their disposal, and later production models even had an additional 16mm thick steel sheet welded on, as in the T-72M1 modification. While the Polish T-72M was identical to the basic T-72 in terms of protection, retaining a monolithic steel turret, the upgraded T-72M1 was closer to the T-72A in terms of protection. An additional 0.63 inches of high-density steel applique armor on the front plate resulted in a 1.7-inch increase of line-of-sight thickness. It was the first export variant with composite turret armor containing ceramic rods, sometimes referred to as sandbar armor. Before the Russian occupiers invaded, Ukraine was using a small number of Soviet T-72s that remained in service, modernizing them. In addition to this, after the start of the war, Poland provided Ukraine with 200 T-72s to further protect its sovereignty against the Russian takeover. The Czech Republic also joined in, transferring a certain amount of Soviet military equipment to the armed forces of Ukraine, both T-72s and BMP-1s. In return, Germany promised both countries that it would carry out the procedure necessary for replacing the given T-72s with Leopard tanks. However, according to the president of Poland, Andrzej Duda, the German authorities have still not come through on their promise. In response to this statement, German officials were greatly offended, stating that they needed more time. But Ukraine has been waiting for help from Germany for more than 3 months, and it's more than fair that other countries have also begun to wonder what German weapons will get to the front line. Speaking of Leopards, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz and Defense Minister Christine Lambrecht have, almost every week now, made statements about the transfer of various weapons to Ukraine. Unfortunately, only 7 Panzerhaubitze self-propelled guns can be spoken for from the entire list they'd announced. According to the German authorities, the soldiers of the armed forces of Ukraine will soon finish training in the use of these self-propelled guns. Earlier on, Germany volunteered to provide Ukraine with modern Iris-T air defense systems to protect large cities, COBRA counter-battery radars, and even began negotiations with Greece on the supply of BMP-1s. However, the saddest thing about the letter is that Greece announced its readiness to transfer about 100 BMP-1 units to Ukraine only after Berlin sends the country the Martyr BMPs they promised to replace. Apparently, the Greeks are not ready to put up with Germany's promises and follow in the footsteps of Poland, which is still waiting for its tanks. In April, the media began to circulate the news that the RHEINMETALL concern was preparing to supply Ukraine with Leopard 1A5 tanks, since defense companies now have about 100 units of such tanks removed from service in the warehouses of defense companies. At the same time, the general director of the company, Armin Paperger, announced his readiness to share the equipment. At the time, he clarified that the German authorities should give permission for this supply. While the head of RHEINMETALL puzzled the German authorities, Spain also gave cause for concern, declaring its readiness to provide Ukraine with Leopard 2 tanks and anti-aircraft missile systems, waiting only for approval from Berlin. Do I even need to say how this story ends? As a result, the transfer of 40 Leopard 2A4 tanks stored for 10 years at the logistics base with the Spanish Army was blocked by the German authorities. These used tanks were purchased by Spain back in 1995, and have since been kept in excellent condition through regular maintenance. All of them are armed with a 120mm RHEINMETALL smoothbore gun capable of firing 2 types of ammunition, including APF SDST and Heat MPT. It is further assisted by a coaxial 7.62mm machine gun mounted to the left of the main armament, a 7.62mm machine gun at the loader's hatch, and 2 rows of 4 grenade launchers mounted on each side of the tank turret. Of the significant changes in the modification of the Leopard 2A4, it is worth noting that it has automated fire extinguishing and explosion suppression system, a fully digital fire control system that facilitates the use of new types of ammunition, as well as an improved turret with flat titanium tungsten armor. Considered one of the best MBTs ever created, the Leopard 2 would be a worthy ally in fighting off the invaders, with which the armed forces of Ukraine are constantly fertilizing the Ukrainian soil. Unfortunately for now, we're still left with the question of how soon will the voice of the German people be heard by authorities and, in particular, by Mr. Scholz regarding their request to give Ukraine weapons. Despite the existence of so-called tacit agreements between NATO member countries not to supply tanks and combat aircraft to Ukraine, it's not too late for them to change their minds while the Russian invaders have yet to successfully expand their already enormous territory by trying to grab a piece of Europe. Everyone here has studied history before, yeah? France is one of those countries that supports Ukraine in the fight against Russian aggression by supplying weapons and humanitarian aid. At the same time, the country's president, Emmanuel Macron, like Olaf Scholz, continues to talk regularly with Russia's insane dictator. This happens so often that many politicians are jokingly suggesting that the heads of Germany and France be banned from talking to Moscow on the phone in the next round of sanctions. And if we're still talking about heavy weapons, then France may well transfer at least a couple of dozen of its famous Leclerc MBTs created by Giat Industries, now known as Nexter Systems. France, along with England, is rightfully the pioneer of armored warfare since the First World War, and by the beginning of World War II, this European country had even more tanks than Germany at the time. Additionally, they were better armed and had more effective armor, but they all fell victim to bad military doctrine. Before the advent of the South Korean K2 Black Panther and the Japanese Type 10, the AMX-56 Leclerc was considered the most expensive MBT, and the cost of only one such tank by 2011 was $9.3 million, which is significantly more than even the cost of the improved M1A2 Abrams with a price tag of $7.56 million. In the early 2000s, against this background, some French military described it as a tank for which the people paid a fortune and which will never be used in combat. Generally speaking, such an opinion would be quite true if these multi-ton colossi had not demonstrated their effectiveness in Yemen, where the UAE threw 2 Leclerc divisions into the civil war. As a result, the AMX-56 turned out to be no less formidable in combat than the American M1 Abrams. One of the tank's unique features is its automatic loading system with a rate of fire of up to 15 rounds per minute, thanks to which the crew of the vehicle was reduced to 3 people: the commander, gunner, and driver. It also sported a 12.7mm M2HB QBC machine gun located coaxially with the main gun instead of next to the commander's hatch. Its F1 120mm smoothbore gun is slightly longer than the Abrams, therefore it can more effectively engage enemy armored vehicles by firing programmable high-explosive air blast fragmentation projectiles. Regarding the armor, the Leclerc loses slightly to the American MBT, since with the same frontal armor it has more weak points around the sensors, and instead of composite armor, it offers an unusual combination of composite, traditional, and dynamic armor, more effective against enemy tank kinetic projectiles. The side armor of the French tank is also worth noting, since the new AMX-56 models have titanium armor inserts and blocks of high-explosive reactive armor on the sides, a kind of belt of explosives that detonate if incoming missiles and shells are detected. Due to the smaller turret profile than other MBTs and the ability to create a multispectral smokescreen, getting this tank is not such an easy task. When confronting opponents, the tank has, among other things, some infrared tricks up its sleeve too. However, the main bit is its weight of 60 tons, which is on average 10 tons lighter than most MBTs of even the strongest militaries, and a relatively high maximum speed of 45 miles per hour. Taking into account the fact that France has given the armed forces of Ukraine at least some 155mm Caesar self-propelled guns, pushing the invaders away from the front line, the likelihood of supplying heavier weapons in the form of battle tanks shouldn't be written off just yet. Against the backdrop of ardent criticism of the German authorities, one should not forget that the Ukrainian people today are friends with the strongest military countries of today, the United States and Great Britain. And where Germany cannot help, the existing lend-lease agreements will. In connection with the conflict's growing escalation and the growing territorial appetites of the occupying command, the U.S. General Staff is quite clearly aware of the consequences of the war in Ukraine if the armed forces of Ukraine do not receive heavy weapons in sufficient quantities. Therefore, in addition to the MLRS, tanks and fighters may soon be on the move as well. Among the tanks, the most likely would be the legend of American tank building, the previously mentioned M1 Abrams. Evolving from the joint American-German project MBT-70, but faced with financial costs, the U.S. Army revealed the XM803 tank to the world to replace their M60. However, it was soon canceled. Having revised goals and priorities, TACOM formed a new design base for its future tank, and in 1976, after a series of design changes, Chrysler and GM presented their prototypes, XM1. Shortly after extensive testing at U.S. test sites along with the Leopard 2 to identify the weaknesses and advantages of the design, the M1 Abrams entered service in 1980 and to this day has faithfully served as the main battle tank for the U.S. Army. Having gone through a harsh learning experience in the form of the campaign to liberate Kuwait from Iraqi occupation, the Iraq War, the war in Afghanistan, the invasion of Yemen, and a number of other operations, the Abrams have deservedly secured the title of being one of the most powerful tanks in history. While other countries focused on the external characteristics of their MBT, the United States devoted tens of thousands of hours to everything, including the inner stuffing of their creation. The latest Abrams include depleted uranium armor, digital upgrade package, parts commonality program, CROWS and CROWS 2 support, improved fire control system with commander's thermal imager and a laser rangefinder with a thermal camera for gunner, digital maps, communications capabilities via Linux Battle Command Brigade Force XX1, and below FB-CB2 for commanders, an improved cooling system to compensate for the heat generated by additional computer systems. Generally speaking, the description of all these innovations might give you the feeling that you're not actually in a tank, but rather in a server room with good air conditioning and hundreds of complex components, each of which is tuned for maximum efficiency and task fulfillment. All this goodness is dressed up in reliable front armor in the form of a multi-layered array, up to 860mm thick, from 2 sheets of armor steel and a composite filler in between. Side armor on the turret made from an aluminum plate with an air layer and 3 19mm uranium ceramic plates. Soft kill active protection system, AM-VLQ-6 missile countermeasure device MCD, which interferes with the tracking systems of semi-automatic anti-tank missile systems. Who knows, maybe some of these tanks will end up in Ukraine later on, and there will be even more destroyed Russian scrap metal and its unfortunate crew in the country's fertile fields. And the last, but by no means least in our tank race, is Great Britain. Boris Johnson quickly made it clear which side he was on in this war, supporting the Ukrainian people in their outcast struggle against the Russian occupiers. Let's recall at least some of the impressive military assistance to Ukraine in the form of Mastiff armored vehicles, tracked Stormer HVMs, dozens of heavy Malloy T-150 UAVs, STARSTREAK air defense systems, thousands of NLAWs, Brimstone missiles, and other equally useful ammunition and tons of humanitarian aid. But one of the most useful packages from the UK might be the Challenger 2 tanks. The Challenger 2, or FV4034, is a British third-generation MBT, the successor to the Challenger 1, developed back in the 1990s. This 64-ton peacekeeper has proven its effectiveness on the battlefield during the invasion of Iraq. Unlike their French counterparts with Leclerc, the British decided not to trust the automatic loader in place of a person to carry out an important part of the mission. After rigorous testing, they came to the conclusion that automation reduces the survivability of the vehicle on the battlefield, and the main problems were the mechanical failures of such equipment and the time spent on their repair. Therefore, the requirements for a crew of 4 remained relevant. The Challenger 2 is protected by second-generation Chaubem armor, whose mass effectiveness against high-explosive anti-tank rounds is twice that of uniformed rolled armor. The primary concern with the design was the safety of the crew, so a semiconductor electric drive was used to move the turret and gun instead of hydraulics, which could pass fluid into the fighting compartment. The fangs of the Challenger 2 is its 120mm L30A155 caliber cannon, the successor to the L11 mounted on the Chieftain and Challenger 1. The L30A1 stands out from other NATO MBT guns in that it has a rifled barrel. This is due to the continued preference of the British Army for the use of high-explosive fragmentation, or HESH ammunition, in addition to finned armor-piercing rounds. By the way, HESHs have a longer range than APF-SDS and are more effective against both thin-skinned vehicles and buildings. And let's not forget about the 7.62mm L94A1 EX34 machine gun mounted coaxially to the left of the main gun, nor the 7.62mm L37A2 placed on the loader hatch ring. Speaking of that, it's also worth noting not only the advanced digital computer from computing devices, but also the stabilized sight with built-in laser rangefinder, which boasts a range of anywhere from 660 feet to 6.2 miles. Then there's the passive periscope for the driver from Tails Optronics, with image enhancement for more convenient control and a rear-view thermal imaging camera. Claiming that their tank was superior to the Leopard 2 or the Abrams in some aspects, the Department of Defense opposed the purchase of a new MBT from abroad. And in March of 2021, the agency published the command document Defense in a Competitive Age, in which it confirmed plans to modernize 148 Challenger 2, assigning them the name Challenger 3. Looking at how quickly Britain volunteered to transfer the MLRS M270 to Ukraine on a par with the United States, it can be assumed that the country's consent will be no less if one of them decides to supply these beasts to Ukraine. What do you think? What kind of weaponry is Ukraine lacking in order to effectively cook these invaders to the point of being well done? Share your guesses in the comments below, and if you enjoyed today's video, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and switch on notifications so you don't miss on more content just like this. Thanks, and we'll see you in the next one.